Hi everyone, and welcome to the third video in the QDU Academy series for the Year 11 competition. Today we will be talking about the second long prep debate in this topic, which is that we should not rebuild areas prone to natural disasters. So in today's session we'll be covering a couple of things. Firstly, we will be covering a bit of context for the debate. Secondly, we will be covering a bit of setup for the debate, so that's what we should be including in this debate. Thirdly, we'll do a bit of brainstorming. Finally, we'll go through a bit of information about points of informations, and finally we'll go through a bit of debate tips and questions. First, it's really important to ask yourselves why we are having this debate. This is a question you should ask yourselves before every topic, because every debate is underpinned by a problem. It is important to unpack this problem to understand what you need to prove in order to win the debate. On the screen, I have a few examples of real-life issues which would affect this debate. One of the most recent issues were the Northern Rivers floods which affected Lismore and northern New South Wales. Lismore was flooded in 2022, 2017, 1989 and 1974. Note here how floods are projected to become more common. Another issue are the frequent cyclones in tropical North Queensland. These often affect tourist towns such as Airlie Beach, Bundaberg, Mackay and Cairns. Given the increased risk of climate change, this article outlines that due to the high risk of natural disasters, insurance is likely to become non-existent or unaffordable for the majority of residents. It is important here now to consider alternatives. Finally, the bottom image is an article by the New York Times outlining whether it is better to rebuild or relocate after natural disasters. Despite many natural disasters, there is still a number of people who choose to live in disaster-prone areas. They are willing to accept any potential harms that come out of this. It is important to think about A, whether it is the government's obligation to support people who choose to live here in these areas, and B, why people continue to choose to live in disaster-prone areas. The next thing that is important to think about is a burden in a debate. So a burden is essentially what you need to prove in order to win the debate, and you figure out your burden by understanding what the problem is in the debate and what your team is trying to solve. So generally, the affirmative team's burden is that there is a problem that exists and that something needs to change. And the negative team usually has two burdens. They have either A, that there is not a problem, or B, that there is a problem but the change proposed by the affirmative team would bring more harm than good. For this debate specifically, the affirmative team's burden would likely be why rebuilding in disaster-prone areas is unsustainable and ultimately lead to more harms than residents than the alternative, which is like relocating, for example. The negative team's burden is probably why relocating will actually be worse for people living in disaster-prone areas. So despite rebuilding's harms, why is this still better than like the alternative of relocation? Now we will be discussing principal arguments. Principal arguments are often the first point in any debate, and they are a core value on which the debate is upheld. Usually principal arguments don't necessarily win debates, but the purpose of them is to provide a strong foundation on why the adjudicator should care about the debate. This is particularly good if your site, for example, has weaker practical material, because you can potentially say that even if your practical material didn't stack up to the practical material brought by the opposition, your side still believes that we should intrinsically do something. So that's when you push your principle a bit further. Some common principle points often include the government's obligation to regulate or ban something, freedom of speech/choice, safety/health, informed consent/rationality of people. So, for this debate specifically, there are a couple of examples of what a potential principle might be. These could include why the government would have an obligation to protect people, or why people would have the right to choose where they live and why the government must support this. These are simply two examples, and there are a lot of different principles that you can use in this debate, so make sure to do a bit of brainstorming on the potential principle clashes and potential principle points that you can use as points for this debate. Secondly, we're going to go through how to structure principal arguments. Firstly, we always structure it with a claim, so that's basically our overarching point of our principle. After that, we often do an initial pump or analogy. That's when we use a different example and we explain how that example is like similar to the right that we are defending. So for example, if we were to ban smoking, we could use the analogy of banning illicit drugs and how the reason why we ban illicit drugs is because they are really harmful for people's health. And then we can apply that same logic to the reason why we should ban smoking as well. Finally, we explain why this matters and why we should care. At the end of this point, if you want to make it a lot more stronger as well, it's important to explain why, even if your practical material as a team wasn't necessarily stronger than the opposition's practical, why that still meant that your principle was particularly strong and you still had to do what your team said. For example, here, it would be good to weigh up what the opposition might bring up as a principal point and think about trade-offs. The next type of argument we're going to go through are practical arguments. So these are the practical harms or benefits that come out of a debate. You will probably have many practical points. It is important when you see a topic or when you are in prep to write out as many benefits or harms you can think of and then group these into themes. We structure practical points in a different way to principal points. We use the structure shown here. Firstly, we say our claim, so for example, why your side was going to get better health, for example. Then we use our mechanism. So our mechanism is the specific pathway in which our benefit or harm will occur. A mechanism is really important because it tells the adjudicator why the outcome that you are advocating for is likely, and therefore it makes your speech a lot more persuasive. Make sure you note this when you are writing your points, because a lot of teams, especially in the senior levels, forget to include mechanisms, and that makes debates a lot harder to adjudicate. Thirdly, we go through a bit of analysis. So why do you think that particular harm or benefit will be so significant or so great? Finally, make sure you explain to the audience why we should care about that particular harm or benefit. This is really important because it makes sure that your practical arguments aren't simply a list of subpoints or a list of benefits. Rather, you are able to link everything to the greater context of the debate and really impact to me what your team was able to get that the opposition's team wasn't able to get. The next thing we will go through are stakeholders. So stakeholders are simply the people that are involved in the debate. It is important to think about A, their motivations, B, the impact of these motivations, and C, why we care about these people. It's also important to think about whether there are any sympathetic stakeholders that are in this debate. So sympathetic stakeholders are simply people that the audience is more likely to care about. So for example, we are less likely to care about a mining company CEO than like Indigenous people whose land is being taken over for the purposes of mining. I'll just note here, the next part is a bit of a more advanced stuff, but if you were to get in a debate where both teams were to care about the same stakeholder, so let's take minorities for example, and it was clear that both teams weren't really getting anywhere by proving why their team cared more about that stakeholder, it would be better to shift the debate to why the benefits that particular stakeholder would achieve would be mutually exclusive under your side. What this means is that you are able to distinguish your team's benefits against the opposition's teams, and it just makes the distinguishment between both teams in the debate a lot more clear. Finally, it's also pretty important to consider like a spectrum of harm in your debate when you are like characterizing stakeholders or you are considering the impact of like a debate on a stakeholder. What this looks like is considering like the best case scenario that your stakeholder will achieve and the worst case scenario a stakeholder will achieve, and comparing this to the opposition's best and worst case scenario as well. A couple of things you might want to consider in this debate. Firstly, I want you to consider who are the types of people who live in disaster-prone areas. Why do they continue to live here? And what are the towns that consistently experiencing disasters commonly consist of / rely on for income? So this might be like tourism, this might be like mining, this might be a lot of different things. I want you to think about, firstly, if there are any specific groups you can think of. And finally, when you are writing your stakeholders, it's important to describe them in a lot of different contexts as well. So as I said before, because this makes your argument a lot stronger. Finally, I want you to think about the motivations of like the government or the people rebuilding these towns. Think about how rebuilding or relocation will be done and whether like these are the best stakeholders to conduct this type of work. Finally, I just want you to consider the characteristics of disaster-prone towns. Finally, I'm going to go through a bit of impacting. So impacting is probably one of the most important features of a speech, and unfortunately one of the features that students miss out on the most as well. This is the end of your speech where you tell the adjudicator why they should care about a topic or why that your point was really important. It's important to include a sentence at the end of every claim and end of every rebuttal point to impact that point to the audience. There's a couple of ways you can impact this. So there are a couple of like common metrics for this. Firstly, if we are implementing something, we can tell the adjudicator how it's so important by mentioning like the sheer number of people who are affected. Secondly, when we are describing the harm of something, we can measure how intense that harm it is and describe that harm to the audience. Thirdly, when we are rebutting someone's point, once we have disproved that point, what does this necessarily mean for their case? This is particularly important if, for example, the opposition has a dependent principle, so that's when their principal point relies on a lot of your practical points. If you are able to disprove their practical points, what does this then mean for their principal point, which relied on that practical material? Finally, it's important to be comparative when you are impacting. What does your world look like versus what the opposition's world look like? And which world is just like simply better to live in? Finally, we're just going to go through a couple of bits on points of information. So this is a bit of a refresher on last week's points of information. I would just like to point out there's a YouTube video on the QDU YouTube channel, which has a video on how to offer points of information and also how to accept points of information. But points of information are really important for a couple of things. They are important in terms of clarifying what the opposition said. This is good if the opposition wasn't very clear and you just wanted them to explain their point a bit more. Secondly, it's pretty important if you want to challenge what the opposition has said. This is particularly good if you want to bring up an example in a point of information and ask the opposition to address that. Thirdly, points of information are good to interrupt the opposition. This is really good if the opposition hasn't really been responsive in terms of rebuttal and hasn't really rebutted anything you said. It would be important to ask them to address a certain point that you have said by bringing up your own material. Finally, points of information are an opportunity to principally extend. So that's basically when you give an extra scenario and you ask whether the opposition would implement this or not based on their principal argument. We can word principal points of information in a couple of ways. Firstly, points of information must be in the form of a question. Secondly, you can word it as inserting an idea and then asking how you would respond. Thirdly, you can say why you particularly cared about why someone was saying something, and then but don't you think that blah 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 blah. That's basically when we are challenging them. And finally, we can mention something that they said earlier and then give an example of why this might be incorrect. So here are a couple of points of information examples. I will probably not read this out just because you are probably able to pause the video and read these through, but these are really good examples of how points of information can be used very strategically, but also really well in terms of inserting your material into the opposition's points and then just reiterating why your material is really important. So, some helpful hints for winning this debate. Firstly, impacting will be really important in being ordered to win this debate, but also persuade to the adjudicator why your team was substantially different or better than the opposition's team. Here, I want you to think about the long-term benefits or harms that are achieved under both sides of the House. Secondly, I want you to think about the best case and worst case scenario under your side versus the opposition side. When you are thinking about this, think about what types of benefits are mutually exclusive under your side. So these are the benefits that will only exist under your side and will not exist under the opposition side. That is really important, and I can't emphasize that enough. Fourthly, I think you want to also impact the extent of natural disasters. This can probably be done very strategically and can even be debate winning, so that might be something that you want to consider. Finally, I want you to think about to focus on the types of people that live in disaster-prone areas, but more importantly, why people continue to live in these areas and really explore this idea and topic. Thirdly, I think it would also be quite useful to think about some areas where governments have not allowed people to live. So how would these be similar or different to disaster-prone areas? Some examples of countries which are relocating are like Fiji, and some other countries which are rebuilding are like the US. So maybe it would be useful to use a couple of case studies from these countries to support your points. Just a reminder that there are a lot of resources on the QDU YouTube channel, and there are also a lot of resources on the QDU website as well. All the best for the third round of the Year 11 competition.